Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and will highlight what's working in your rural communities. You will hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Saydorf.
Well, I'm really excited to be able to talk to a colleague of mine from Montana. Tobin Novasio is the superintendent of the Hardin Public Schools located in Montana, and we're going to be talking about his district and his state and some of the work that he's done at the local, state, and national levels as far as rural education. And then there's some other things that he's doing with AASA that I want to dive into and get a feel for what he's doing around mental health to support students, not just in rural communities, but in all communities. So, Tobin, welcome to the Rural Scoop. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, Melissa, thank you for having me. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to share our story.
Well, let's dive right in then. Tell us a little bit about you, your background, Hardin School District. I'd love to hear where you are in the world and how you got there.
Yeah, so a little bit of my history. I'm a Montana native. I grew up here in Montana. It's actually kind of a typical Montana story now. I grew up in a community called Red Lodge, and when I grew up, it was a farm and ranch community that happened to have a ski area and happened to be close to the Beartooth Pass where the entrance into Yellowstone Park is. And it's transitioned, like a lot of our state, into a touristy recreational area. And just the community's really changed a lot. But got into teaching and coaching through some of my mentors. The coaches and the teachers I had influenced me, and started my career. Did a little bit of coaching back in my hometown, but I wasn't teaching at that time. Starting my teaching career on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in a school district, neighboring school district where I am now. Lame Deer was the name of that school district. And then I actually left there and went to rural Alaska and taught in the bush in Alaska, right at the mouth of the Yukon River, Lower Yukon School District. When I talk about my rural bona fides, I mentioned the fact that I've coached mix 6 volleyball. A lot of people have never heard of that, but in rural Alaska, the schools are so small that for one of the sports that they offer is co-ed volleyball for high school athletes. So that was a fun experience, yeah. And then got pulled into administration at my former district in Lame Deer, and came back there originally as the assistant principal and athletic director, and just stayed there for several years and moved up into the principal position. And then got an offer to jump into the superintendency, and took my first superintendent job at a very small rural school. 𝐂𝐲𝐲𝐲𝐫𝐢 was the name of the school. In fact, I coached 6-man football when I was there, and my last year we had 7 boys on the roster. Yeah, you have to have a contingency plan for everything when you only have one extra player. And so got into the superintendency there, and then my daughter was born, and at that time I ended up wanting more time for myself and not having to be the athletic director and all those different things that you do, all the different hats you wear as a rural administrator. And went to another small rural school but it was in Wyoming, where the funding was a lot better than it is here in Montana at the time. And I was a principal at 10 Sleep schools in the Bighorn Mountains. Beautiful, beautiful place. And I always say, if it weren't for the situation with my daughter, I probably would have never left there. It was just it was a great job. Just the situation with my daughter and custody cases, I guess, personal issues, and came back to Montana as a superintendent and served just west of Billings in a rapidly growing area, suburban area, just a small K-8 district. I think when I started there, we had about 350 students. And then moved to the Lockwood School District, again, another K-8 school district, much bigger at that time, and went through the process there of changing the law in Montana so that we could add a high school into that district, and then went through that process of building a high school and passing the bonds and going from 0 to 60 with your high school staff and sports and activities and all those type of things. I spent a total of 11 years there in Lockwood. And just as I approached kind of towards the end of my career, I had an opportunity to come to a neighboring district. And speaking rural, it's 40 miles away, the neighboring district. And so I'm now at Hardin, and it's in Bighorn County. It's adjacent to Yellowstone County, which is where Billings is. And the county is the size of the state of Delaware. And our school district takes up about 2/3 of that space. About 2/3 of that land. In fact, a quarter of my bus routes go 200 miles a day. And we serve about 1,800 students. So we're a little bit larger than some of the typical rural schools in Montana. But we do sit on the just adjacent to the Crow Native American reservation, and we actually serve some of the Northern Cheyenne reservation as well too. So our population is just shy of 90% Native American, and so there's some challenges that go along with that. Specifically the generational trauma that our students, and we can talk about that a little bit when we get into the mental health side of things. But I really wanted to have an opportunity to come back. I think when as you go through your career as an administrator or teacher, you look back and go, God, I wish I'd have known this back then. Mm-hmm. Yep. And having similar populations to what I had when I was a principal and a young teacher in Lame Deer, just now having the connections I've had, through my opportunities with AASA and other groups that I've been involved in, to bring those skills that I've been able to learn and try and make a difference in the community that I'm in now.
So, you are a very well recognized superintendent at the state and the national level for some of the work that you've done in your leadership. And you, I'm sure, have had opportunities to move away from a rural setting. What's kept you rural?
I think it's just the relationships is what it really boils down to. Certainly right now, and we're going to talk about the teacher shortage, which leads to the principal shortage, which leads to the superintendent shortage. Yep. And, the headhunting companies and the calls that you get. And one of the things that my wife and I have talked about is I never wanted to move to a district where there was more than one high school. I think you lose that sense of community when you get, and I know it's kind of a strange divider line, but I think you lose that sense of community as you get bigger, and you have to worry about, well, we can't do this because it's not fair to the other school, or those right. type of things. And just being able to know people by name and develop those relationships. I think we all went into education because of relationships is one of my true beliefs.
Yeah. So let's talk about the teacher shortage, because you're right. I think it's probably one of the most, if not the most significant challenge that we're facing as rural administrators across the country. Talk about what that looks like for you and what you've done to try to mitigate.
Yeah, so that's our number one issue right now, for us, for sure. And a lot of times it's dominoes as well too, as there becomes a shortage. The larger communities are able to attract, especially our younger teachers getting into the field. There's nightlife, there's medical, there's shopping, movie theaters, and so when they have a shortage, they seem to kind of suck the oxygen out of the room, and we lose those teachers from our rural schools. And we just I serve on the Montana Rural Education Association Board of Directors. Been on that for over a decade now, and that conversation just continues to get more and more. We don't think it can get any worse, and then it gets worse. And right. So in fact, I just had a conversation with one of the ladies in my office. We have teachers arriving from the Philippines that fly in Sunday at noon, and so she's going to pick them up and take them to buy, because they're coming with nothing, to take them to buy mattresses and bedding. And as a school, we're, the human thing is to help provide that and make sure that they're set up. But that's an area that we've really dove into. In fact, through some of the work with AASA, we actually have a talking group to talk about the J-1 visas and what kind of legislation we can do to to maybe adjust some of that. The tough part is you invest in those folks and they become part of your community. You do the professional development with them, and then they have to go back after 3 to 5 years.
Right.
And you don't know if you're going to get them back or not. So, if that's going to be something we have to lean on to fill our openings in our rural schools, if there's a way we could extend those visas so that when we invest in those people and we build those relationships with those people, we can keep them here. But going back to the Rural Education Association in Montana here, that was our big topic of conversation yesterday, and a lot of ours comes back to funding as well too.
Sure.
One thing that in Montana, our funding formula is really driven by enrollment, as it is in a lot of states. And so if you're growing, it's a good formula for you. But if you're holding steady, and certainly if you're losing, and we know a lot of our rural communities are getting smaller. I joked about 𝐂𝐸𝐲𝐲𝐫𝐢𝐠𝐡𝐭 I had 7 boys we had about 45 kids, I think, in the high school total.
Wow.
At that time. And this was, 2 decades ago. But I had a board member run for the board because he specifically didn't want us to co-op for sports with our neighboring district, which was only 10 miles away. And that one of my former football players is now the coach there. And I know a couple of years ago, they were actually co-oping with 5 schools to put together a 6-man football team. So
Wow.
there's, as the family farm, it becomes more automated or just gets bought up, there's less and less folks in our smaller schools. And so you're getting hit with that loss of funding due to the lower A and B. It has nothing to do with the number of teachers that you have. I mean, if I have 18 kids in a 2nd grade or I have 12 kids in a 2nd grade, I still need that same teacher and it still costs me the same amount.
Right.
And then, so here in Hardin, we actually service, we have 4 different elementary schools. So we have elementary schools in 2 different communities. We have one in Crow Agency, which sits it's actually on the Crow Reservation. It's actually right where Custer's last stand and it happened historically, if you have any history buffs out there. But the other one sits on the Yellowtail Reservoir. It's called Fort Smith, and it's a 2-room schoolhouse. And when we get our reports back from the state, it's costing us $10,000 more per student to educate kids at Fort Smith. And it's right now it's too far to bus kids in for the primary grades. It's 45 miles away. If it gets much smaller, we might have to make that hard decision. But for now, we're going to try to keep it open and keep it operating. But you have to have somebody to answer the phones. You have to have somebody to clean the building. You have to have somebody to cook the lunches as well, too, regardless of if you have 80 kids or you have, like we do, I think it's 16 next year is what we're looking at. So the other thing that's hurt us in Montana a little bit is we have a inflationary cap on our funding formula as well, too. So the last couple legislative sessions, and we meet every 2 years in Montana, it's capped at 3.5%. And so our real life costs are 6, 8, 10% of inflation. Especially, for a long time, it was the health insurance was driving that, and that was what we were talking about. But frankly, now some of the things that are driving it is property and liability insurance. Our property and liability insurance this year is going up by $100,000 is what our first proposal is. We're trying to negotiate that down, obviously, but you're talking about a 25 to 30% increase in a lot of our schools because the cost of replacing those buildings, which they have to be insured at, has just skyrocketed. You're talking, in Montana, you're talking $500 a square foot for school construction for new schools. In some cases, so we're just, our budgets are especially our rural schools are flatlined, and the cost of doing business has gone up, and then just there's a teacher shortage everywhere. And, especially young teachers first going into the business, they're going to look at, the quality of life and where they're living. And they're coming from a community that has a college. So they're used to having the entertainment and restaurants and those type of things. And so moving to a place, that doesn't necessarily always have those is a lifestyle change for them, and to take less money to do so even. Housing is huge in Montana. we've dealt with the post-COVID boom of homes being bought up by folks that don't live there year round. We also have the increased cost of construction that goes along with a lot of that. And then, so we here in Hardin, a lot of our teachers are already commuting from Billings because that's where the housing is available. So they're driving 80 miles round trip every day. And if they're offered a job that even pays similar, they have to do the math for themselves as well too. So, that's just that's a huge part of the challenges that I think that we're dealing with. And we have we had a super majority Republican last legislative session. And, so we dealt with some of the charter bills and those things that have been popping up across the country. I know you being in Arizona, obviously you guys are ground zero for some of that.
Yes, we are. Yep.
And know what the impact on that can be on your public schools as well too. So we've had to kind of play defense on that. And we have a for-profit or non-public charter school bill, I guess, that got passed last legislative session, and it's still being fought in court right now. So we do have the opportunity to create charter schools, public, underneath the guise of the public schools, the guidance of the school boards. And I think there's 18 of those that are starting up next year. It's the first ones in Montana, and I think that shows some of the creativity that schools will do to try to meet the needs of our students. But we know that if those for-profit ones get in there, that's going to divert a lot of our funds that are needed for all students to schools that can say no to those students if they want.
Right. So I want to go back and touch on two things that you talked about. The first was principal pipeline, because I think that that's probably something we don't pay attention to often enough in national discussions around shortages as it relates to rural education. And then the second thing I want to touch on when we get a chance to talk through that is closures and consolidations, because at least in the West, we have very large, geographically speaking, very large districts. Mine is 600 square miles and we're 400 students. And so, there's always been big debate around, do you close and consolidate, and are you able to create economies of scale if you do that? And is it, good for kids or not good for kids and for communities as well that lose their school? So let's talk first about the principal pipeline. What is it looking like for you in Montana, and what are the concerns that you and the Montana Rural Education Association may have talked about yesterday?
Yeah, and I'm pretty blessed. We had a couple principal openings in our district this year, and we got a very highly qualified principal that came over from a neighboring district that liked some of the things we were doing and wanted to be part of what we're doing. And I think that's part of what we have to do to attract people is make it a place where people want to work. And then we also had an in-house person that was ready to make that step in their career. But
it's good.
I can tell you there's a lot of communities where they've struggled to find principals and even tapping, teachers on the shoulder. Hey, this is something I think you might be good at. I've had teachers, shake their head and be like, are you crazy? There's no reason I want to go into administration, and I think kind of the shift that we saw post-COVID, just kind of on the national scale and is part of that. And the job becomes more and more of dealing, that was probably, it's over 20 years ago now that I first stepped into administration, but I was really shocked at like how much time you spend thinking of ways to not get sued as an administrator. Yeah. I mean, you're almost a part-time lawyer at times.
Yeah.
It just seems there's less and less. And then, it's again, as we have fewer teachers going in, we have fewer that want to go into the administration level. And then that actually ends up being a shortage at the superintendent level. We talked yesterday about, who's taking this job and who's taking that job. And Montana's unique. We do have, you talk about, we want to talk about consolidation a little bit, but we have 400 school districts in the state of Montana, and some of it's due to the size. We're a very strong local control state, or we have been in the past at least. And, so there's, I think in our Superintendent's Association, typically we'll have, around 200 members. And some of those are part-time. Some of those they oversee 2 districts. So like for us with Hardin, we have a separate elementary and high school district because there's other areas that feed into our high school. And so technically we're 2 districts, but, and we've been seeing over the last 4 or 5 years, typically about a 25% turnover every year. So that's, you're talking 50 new superintendents every year.
Wow.
And it's seeming more and more those that are stepping into the superintendent role have less experience as a principal and even less experience as a teacher. I do some mentoring for our administrators association, and a couple of years ago I was working with a young man that was a superintendent at one of our very smaller rural schools. He'd been in the classroom for 3 years and was now a superintendent.
Wow.
25, 26 years old, and now expected to make those type of decisions and deal with those type of things. And not that age makes it better, or the other thing I think is a change too is when I went through the programs for my master's, we had cohorts, and that group, we were all acting administrators, and we go back to Bozeman to Montana State in the summer, and we would share stories and we would learn from each other. Mm-hmm. And now so much of it's being done online and distance learning that I don't know that these new administrators have those cohorts. And so that's something we've talked about with that mentoring group that I'm in. And we talked a little bit about that yesterday with the Rural Education Association, is how do we find a way to connect our new people and have them be able to develop those cohorts of their peers that they can learn from and develop those relationships from. And even just things like background checks. I never call anybody that somebody lists as a reference on their background check. I call somebody that I know that was in that school district that may have worked with them to get the
sure.
The people that they list are usually going to have all the good things to say, but you want to double check with the people that you know and you trust. Right. And Montana's a lot like Arizona. I'm sure one of the things I always tell new administrators is you don't want to pass the trash and give people bad information on those type of reference checks or advice on things, because you're going to see that person at 2 or 3 conferences a year.
That's right.
And those reputations build very fast on who's honest and who's upfront I think we have to find ways, because what happens is I think people get into these superintendent positions and they feel very isolated. I know my first superintendent job, I was still single, had never been married, didn't have any kids. And you're kind of like the unofficial mayor in some of these little small communities where people will come to you, and I had people talking to me about their marital troubles or their, what should I be doing with this kid? And it's like, my job is, my training, I guess I should say, it has always been in, education, what's best educationally and stuff, but it's those people relationships. And, in our small rural counties, a lot of times the school superintendent is they're the highest paid person in the community, and they're looked at as that person that people can go to for help. And you obviously want to fill that role.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was probably one of the hardest transitions for my wife when we got married, is that you are always accessible, and people don't hesitate to come up and talk to you in the coffee shop or the gas station or the grocery store to talk to you about, their opinion on the latest levy, or, who should be coaching the basketball team, or all those things. You lose that anonymity, I guess.
Very much so. Yeah. And if you're not familiar with rural, that might be a surprise when you get into a rural community, how they expect that accessibility.
Well, and it's interesting, and so when I was principal back in Lame Deer, we were a school. It's a very isolated area, and it was tough. We had some tough situations we dealt with. So about a third of my staff would turn over every year, and I just remember, this was pre-Zoom, and we would do phone interviews, and we got a lot of teachers that were looking to get their experience, get their feet wet, get some experience, and then transition to a bigger community or closer to wherever they were from, home or whatever. And we'd also get people like wanted to come from the East Coast or coming from, and that back then it was a river runs through it. Now it's Yellowstone. Got this vision of Montana, and Eastern Montana doesn't necessarily look like it does on the TV or the movie screen sometimes. And like one of the things I would tell them would be like, now you understand, I just being clear, you are going to live 100 miles from the nearest Walmart, just to get that across to them that it is a change in lifestyle, and there's a little, obviously I believe the benefits outweigh the negatives, but to make that transition where, you need to go to Costco and buy groceries on the weekend and have a freezer because you're not going to just run down to the corner market a lot of the time.
It's funny how we judge how close you are to a Walmart in rural communities. That's how you define how close you are to a Walmart. That's funny.
There was a study done about judging rural, and I think Glasgow, Montana was the furthest place you could be in the United States from a Starbucks. And so that was
claim to fame.
Yeah, kind of hit the social media rounds on that one.
That's funny. So talk a little bit about closures and consolidations, because having to weigh whether or not you close Fort Thomas, or was it Fort Smith or Fort Thomas?
Fort Smith.
Having to weigh if you close that school, that's pretty heavy on a superintendent's back, and it has an impact on your community. What does closure and consolidation look like in Montana?
I'll tell you, in Montana, we typically fight tooth and nail to keep those schools open. There's been a few, just a handful that I can name in my career of districts that have gone non-operational, but typically, we do everything we can to keep the schools open, and I know that's to the chagrin sometimes of some of our legislators, and there's been efforts. The issue I think sometimes is it's very easy to say, hey, we've got too many schools, we should shut some down. But then that legislature from that county has to go back and explain why that happened. And
sure.
We've done a whole ton of co-ops for sports and activities. I know at one point we went back and looked at our smallest, our Class C schools, and we looked at just the boys' state basketball tournament. And at one point, I think 6 of those schools no longer existed as a standalone school. They were all part of co-ops. And, typically those are your, the schools that are more successful athletically. It usually translates to they have the better numbers. And so that's how much it's changed. But yeah, we've got some consolidation that's gone on. Like I said, specifically more so on the sports side. We do have some districts that have gone to where they share some of their staff or they share some of their administration. And that's where I think you can get some of that economy of scales. But it's harder then because you don't have those people as part of the community as well too. So I know that there's been some struggle with that. I additionally, I mentioned that we had an area that comes into our high school district. I go out and help their school board and go to their board meetings when I can and help them with policy and whatnot, because there's kind of a little bit of agreement there between the two districts. And it's a one-room schoolhouse. This year they actually had more school board members than they had students in the school, and one teacher by herself. But I think it's been good for us because I've been able to help her with resources. So she, as a standalone teacher, doesn't have a strong background in having done, textbook selection or those type of things. So we're able to help with that. We were able to utilize some of our staff to go down and help out with advice on some students with behavior or some, students that might be dealing with, possible dyslexia. And so we've been able to tap into our resources to help them out. And I think that's the model that we've done in Montana, is we've been able to keep a lot of our schools open because we'll help our neighbors, if that makes sense. And that's kind of one of the rural mindsets.
Yeah, well, it goes to that network of support that you were talking about. And the importance of building those relationships so that you know when you can and should help your neighbor.
Yeah. And just to give an example, and this is part of the problem in Montana when we start talking consolidation, we're in South Central Montana where, close, within, a half hour of Billings, which is the largest community. So we're considered, in fact, some of my colleagues probably wouldn't consider me rural because it's way different than what their rural is. Lockwood High School Lockwood High School the district I came from, that's almost exactly 40 miles. To down to Lodge Grass is probably close to 40 as well. And then over to Lame Deer is probably closer to 60, I would think, overall. So, it's easy to sit in Helena and say, hey, we need to consolidate our schools, but are you really going to put your kid on a bus, or have them driving back from, basketball practice at 7:00 at night or after a game at 2 a.m. on those rural roads and that type of a distance, So there's challenges specifically in Montana just with the distance. And then there's actually challenges with our weather and, sometimes you have roads that aren't, they're passable for 8 months out of the year, but you're not going to be able to go down those roads in the winter, or you don't want to go down those roads.
And now a word from our sponsors. So, Tobin, you've been involved really since the start of AASA's mental health cohort. Talk about what that is and what you've been able to do both through AASA, but also in your own local context with mental health for supports of students.
Yeah. And just to tie this back a little bit, when we talked about the transition in administrators, and not having as much experience, I would say when I started as an administrator, I was really one of those separation, but we'll teach the academics. It's really the parents' job to raise the kids and make sure that that they're getting that support they need on the other side. And just through the years and just realizing, we have kids that have just so many unmet needs. And I was a former health teacher, and and not that I paid all that much attention in psychology, but the Maslow's hierarchy of needs really was something that clicked with me when I was going through my college time, and then always tried to build that into some of my teaching. And certainly as an administrator, we're just seeing so many unmet needs, and it's not getting better. I listed the states I worked in. Montana, Alaska, and Wyoming are typically the top 3 every year in suicides. And so just been able to connect with people out there that are doing good work on how can we help kids, and how and actually would certainly now expand that to staff. Going back to those teacher shortages we talked about too, is in my belief, and I think there's a lot of data out there to support it. I think teaching is a more stressful profession than it's ever been in the history of our country. And so when the mental health cohort started up, I joined right away and was able to be part of that. And I had already been involved in a few other things. Hope Squad is a suicide prevention peer group that you help train kids to recognize those signs of suicide and follow the QPR method. So question, persuade, refer, and make sure that we're connecting them with the right adult to help get their friend help if they're struggling. When I first started teaching and or even when I was going to school, a kid that's thinking about suicide will often ask for help several times before they'll take action. And back then you might find a note from one kid to another or overhear something in the hallway. Well, typically now most of that is happening through a text or it's happening on social media. And we aren't going to overhear that or be part of that conversation as educators. So just giving our students the tools to connect with the proper adults to get somebody help to prevent that type of a tragedy. And then through the mental health cohort and been able to do some work with Cook Center for Human Connection. And I've actually presented at the National Rural Conference with them. And I think we're going to try and present at the NCE. We submitted at NCE next year on some of the tools that are available for rural superintendents all superintendents, but rural specifically, just because of some of the challenges we face with accessibility to resources. And really one of the big fights on the rural side sometimes is eliminating that stigma of mental health concerns. One of the things we talk about time and time again is mental health is health. And we got to take the stigma off of that, especially in a community where everybody knows what your drive and what your car looks like. I'm going to probably go to the chiropractor this afternoon, and I'm not going to think twice about parking my truck in front of the chiropractor's office. But a lot of times in our rural community, people won't feel that same comfort level of parking at the therapist and having people know they're getting therapy. And so we got to get away from that. We go to the dentist, we go to the optometrist, we go to the chiropractor, we go to the therapist, because it's part of keeping ourselves healthy. And so just trying to eliminate that a little bit. And then the other partner with the mental health cohort is the JED Foundation. We were actually blessed to be one of the 15 districts that they selected nationwide for their district comprehensive approach. And we've done some great work with them. They've come in with fresh eyes. The great part of that program is they're not coming in and saying, here's a bottled program that we think is going to fit your district. They're coming in and working with our specific community resources, our specific demographics, our specific location, and saying, here's some options you have. One of the great things that they've done for us, and we're working on still, is when they did their site visit, is we're actually going through and resource mapping. Okay, what do we have in our district? And some of my veteran principals thought, oh, we've got these 5 or 6 things, and of course, I've brought some things in this year. But once we had that list, I mean, we had like 40 items, and the idea is you want that to be in the hands of every counselor, every principal, every teacher. So if they have a kid or a family that's dealing with something, they can get them to they can give them a menu of resources that we have. Through the Cook Center, we've been very involved in the mental health nights and the parent guidance. And we offer, both here in Hardin and in my previous district, we offer parent coaching for any parents that want to be part of it. So it's a therapist that'll work with those families. Some of that's resource allocation, and this ties right into the rural idea. Often we're putting a lot of resources towards kids in different schools, and they're all from the same family. So is it better return on our investment to help the parents, become better at drawing boundaries or all the different things that they could possibly get help on? And that parent coaching is completely anonymous. So we don't know. I just get a number. This many parents took advantage of it. There's no information. I don't know that, oh yeah, that they're getting counseling and they're getting counseling. And it's just a resource for our families that they can go through and help them with some of the challenges that we have going through parenting. I mean, I've got a master's degree in education and everything else, and there's challenges that I've gone through parenting my 3 kids as they've grown up, and situations you don't deal with. And the other thing is, I think sometimes in a rural community, you can feel very isolated if you're dealing with mental health with your student. The example I've used is if, your child comes home and says they're transgender. In some of our communities, they might be the only one in 5 counties. But if we can connect them with resources and say, no, this is, there's a certain percentage of kids that are going through this, and here's some resources that go with it. So just trying to remove some of that stigma that goes along with mental health in our rural communities. And one of the reasons I'm really passionate about mental health in rural communities is, I obviously have through the years I've lost some students, and just wished I would have seen the signs, or that somebody else would have been able to see the signs. But we're blessed in rural. A lot of times we can look at some of the issues that we read about or that we're dealing with in education and go, well, that's probably more of an urban issue, or that's more of a big district issue. We don't have that happen here. We don't deal with that here. But mental health and I always use suicide as it's a measuring stick of the mental health. For every student suicide or student that reports that they're suicidal, you've probably got another 20 to 50 kids that are dealing with mental health issues. It's just, Unfortunately, suicides are real easy to measure, and so a lot of times we use that as our data point. The journal, I always go back to it's an older study now, but the Journal of American Medical Association pediatric study in 2015 found that the suicide rate for rural youth, and that's age 10 to 24, is double that in urban areas. And that was from, I think, 96 to 2010. So it's pretty long time and pretty significant data. So mental health and suicide is really one of those things that we need to own in the rural communities. And I would actually say, and this might sound terrible, but I think sometimes a suicide in a rural community or even a death related, in Montana, it's gotten a lot better, but traditionally we've dealt with a lot of car accidents and deaths, young people. You always hear the stories about just post-graduation. And I think we all kind of hold our breath that graduation weekend.
Yep.
But when there's a death or an injury or something serious in a rural community, because we are family, because we are tight and we know each other so much better, it seems to me to have a bigger impact sometimes than it does in an urban setting. My children, my older two boys attended much larger high schools in Billings, and if there was a suicide, they'd be like, yeah, I think I had a class with that guy. I think I had a class with him when I was a sophomore, and we were in history together. But in a rural community, in fact, one of my colleagues reached out to me for some resources a couple years ago, and it wasn't a student; it was just a recent graduate, 19, 20-year-old that was in the community. But even at that point, we were on student council together. We were on the track team and rode the bus together. My younger sister is best friends with his younger sister. They were a TA in my little brother's class. We all know each other and we're all connected in our rural communities. And so sometimes that tragedy hits harder, and you have to, obviously we want to focus on prevention when it comes to suicide, right. But that postvention also is a key part, especially in our rural communities where everybody is so tight-knit.
I want to go back, Tobin, to something that you talked about, and that's community asset mapping. And that's something that a lot of our rural leaders really don't know how to do. And it, I think, speaks to a deficit versus an asset lens that people may have about rural place-based resources that you don't traditionally think of as resource, whether they're municipal or it's geography or it's, county services. We tend to look at rural with a deficit lens, and that's a shame because we do all have, to your point, you thought 5 or 6, and no, there's upwards of 40 different things that can really be beneficial to the programming that you're trying to roll out. What would you tell a rural superintendent or a rural principal that really was not familiar with asset mapping to think about or to move forward to try to find what those resources are that are available to them?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what we just talked about, that interconnectedness, and really start building those partnerships. There's going to be partnerships in place, and there's going to be resources that you're not tapping into. So where we're at here, we're blessed with we have support from the Indian Health Services. Your county health departments are another great resource, and there's a lot of the CDC has really embraced some of the mental health challenges. The Surgeon General's really dove into some of that, and so there are becoming more and more resources available for counties and local governments, and they're just looking for partners to partner with to be involved in that, and go out and look at what grants are available. We work with the rural RBHI, Rural Behavioral Health Institute, and it's funded primarily, I believe, by Arthur Blank, that is the Atlanta Falcons owner. And we actually do a twice a year mental health risk behavior assessment through them, which actually allows us, we've now been able to gather some longitudinal data. So just like we look at our test scores, or we look at our attendance scores, or we look at our or attendance data, when we look at our discipline data, we're able to take a look at is our mental health data getting better or worse for our students? And if it's getting worse, just like we would with reading scores or math scores, how do we find an intervention that's going to meet with that? So I would just say reach out, have those conversations, and I would tell people, if you're listening to this, jump online and look at what the JED Foundation has. Look at what the Cook Center has for support, and again, that Rural Behavioral Health Institute as well too, because they're not looking to make money. These are programs that are started by people that have been affected by mental health issues in youth, and they're just looking to make a difference. It's not something that you're going to have to spend a huge part of your budget on. And I guess that's one thing I'd also say too, especially for the superintendents and maybe business managers out there. They talk about you don't prioritize your budget, you budget your priorities. Mm-hmm. And I've had people ask me, well, how do you fund that? We have a plethora of things in place for our students and for our staff, and that's another thing I want to come back and circle back and talk about. But it's less than 0.5% of our overall budget. And again, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I mean, if we don't have our kids in the right mental state to come in and learn on a daily basis, we talked about teacher shortage. I could bring in the staff from Harvard, and I'm still not going to see the academic growth because my kids have those unmet needs. And we've done a better job in education of addressing food insecurity and making sure that, we have programs where we provide coats and gloves, and, we have all of our families in transition homeless programs through McKinney-Vento. And so we're making sure that those physical needs are being met. But the next step, I believe in that, is the mental health needs, and the example I use with adults all the time is we've all gone through the loss of a loved one or somebody that's dealing with a major medical issue. How can you focus on your job? My father passed away about 4 years ago, but he had a long battle with pancreatic cancer. I probably wasn't a real good employee during that time. I mean, because there was a lot of times I was focused on my dad's health and what he was going with, and just the terrible situation he was in with that. And you're going through marital problems. Now imagine doing that when you're a 16-year-old kid that has never been through anything like that. As adults, we've learned to compartmentalize and be able to put some of those things on the shelf. A 16 or 17-year-old or a 12-year-old does not know how to do that. They don't have those skills yet. And then you throw in, they got every hormone in the world running through their body, and they're more inclined to risky behavior. And that's what, you go back to the talking about the suicide, and it's kids don't want to die. They're just looking for a way for their pain or their problems to go away. And, they don't understand that it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, and that they'll be able to get through that. And we as adults have to find ways to connect them with the right resources so that they can understand that. And I'm going to circle back to talking about the staff mental health, and I would hope that most of the listeners here understand that our teachers are under more stress, and our administrators even more so than probably any other time, at least in my 25 years in education. So that was one of the areas that we found here in Hardin that we felt like we had a gap, as we did not have a lot of mental health support for our staff. And it's kind of a sticky wicket sometimes to deal with, because it's like, I go back to staff appreciation. It's you tell me what you want. We try to come up with all these different ideas and stuff, and I mean, really trying to build that two-way communication with our staff as far as what would make your life better for you that we can do as a district. And I think that's an important conversation to have. But one of the partners we did partner with this year, and I would encourage districts to take a look at, is Care Solace. And Care Solace is a way to connect families to mental health resources, but it also, staff can use it. And so they can connect, they can get on there. Going back to the rural, we had to expand, we had to ask them to expand the area that they would look for support in our community, just because the distance, I think it's like the default was like within 15 miles and so we had to expand it. I think we expanded ours to 100 miles. But there's also some telemedicine and different things that are available there as well too. So if you're in a really isolated area, I talk about, when I was in rural Alaska, I was at the mouth of the Yukon River. There were no therapists in the town. But now through Zoom and through those type of things, you have that telemedicine available. And I dealt with some of my own issues when I was there. I have insomnia, and, up there, the light and the isolation really played tricks on me. And, it would have been great to be able to jump on and talk to a virtual therapist to help me through some of those insomnia issues I dealt with when I was up there, So just be aware as we start putting these things in place. Obviously, in education, it's children first, but also think about your staff, and that may be a way of retaining staff as well too, and making them feel that they're. And that's one of the things we've talked about here a little bit with our staff but not just mental health, but we also have invested in some wellness things beyond that, physical wellness. Obviously, our Native American staff and community, that's real high diabetes is a cultural issue that they deal with, and so we've tried to put some things in place, or we're trying to put some things in place on that, but really just making sure our staff understand that we care about them as a person and not just as and I think that's different. I think that is way different in rural schools, because you know those teachers on a personal basis. And in fact, I've had that conversation with colleagues that have stepped in or gone to rural schools from a large school and be like, okay, now you got to understand, now when you're non-renewing somebody, it's not just a name on a list. You know them. You know their children. You've probably been to a barbecue at their house, or you've sat with them at a basketball game, and it becomes much more of a personal connection than it is in your larger districts.
Yeah. Tobin, one of the things I always ask my guests is, what does the term rural advantage mean to you?
Yeah, I certainly believe it comes back to that, what we just talked about with that family and that connection and getting to know people. As we become a more technological society, I think we've lost a lot. We're always connected, but we've lost most of our connections, if that makes sense. And it's very easy to watch TV, watch movies, listen to music, listen to the news that is very specific to just what you like. We've lost those cultural touchstones of, Johnny Carson or the 5:30 news, or, I remember growing up, and they'd have a mini, like Lonesome Dove, or, everybody watched the Monday Night Football game. And now everything is so aimed at your specific likes that we don't have that, like I said, the cultural touchstone. And I think it's very easy to think that everybody thinks exactly the way that I think. And in your rural communities, I think you get away from that, because you connect with those people at, like I said, ball games and community events. And so you may have very good friends that have very different political views, or very different religious views, or come from a different cultural background. And I think in our rural communities, we don't isolate as much as we do in the urban communities. And that builds that sense of community. And it allows us to be able to hear those different opinions better and respect those different opinions better.
That's a good answer. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to make sure our listeners know?
Oh, geez. Just, I would just really say is if you're out there and this is something that you're passionate about, feel free to reach out to me. I will connect you with the rural cohort, the mental health cohort. We also have a rural cohort through AASA.
We do. Yep.
Job too. And then also connecting you with the resources, whether it's JED, the Cook Center, the Rural Behavioral Health Institute, the Hope Squad, any of those resources. I feel like it's our job always to help our colleagues out. So if anybody that's listening wants to reach out, feel free to reach out to me. Pretty easy to find, and willing to share anything that we have.
And what's your best point of contact, Tobin, if they do want to get in contact with you?
Typically email is probably the best way. And so it's just my first name, Tobin.Novasio with an O at Hardin @𝐂12.mt.us.
Perfect. All right. Well, Tobin, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate learning more about what you're doing in Montana, and appreciate your work at both the local and state levels, as well as the national level.
Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate you having me here.
Thank you so much for listening to the Rural Scoop. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, or even leave us a comment. And be sure to follow on Twitter at Dr. Sadorf. That's Dr_SADORF, so that you never miss a new release. You can also check out previous episodes of The Scoop wherever you get your podcasts. Production support for the Rural Scoop is provided by Chattanooga Podcast Studios. Find out more at ChattanoogaPodcastStudios.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education.